I would rather tend camels in the scorching desert than be a slave in my own palace. This fatal choice by the Emir of Seville has just triggered a mechanism of total destruction. Christian swords are already at their throats, and in a fit of mad despair, the rulers of Spain swing open the gates of the Sahara to those they fear more than death itself. Out of the sandstorm emerge the Almoravids, warriors in black veils who know no mercy and have sworn on blood to erase any trace of weakness from the earth. Yusuf ibn Tashfin did not arrive to rescue kings. He came to build an empire upon their ruins. King Alfonso VI is already leading his iron cavalry toward the inevitable, but he has no idea that this battle will be more than just a war. It will be the literal end of the world. The light of Andalusia fades under the thunder of Berber drums, as the air thickens with the scent of steel and inescapable slaughter. The heavy scent of incense and expensive jasmine oil inside the Alcazar of Seville felt like a choking shroud to Emir al-Mutamid as he stared at the map of Al-Andalus, where the golden crosses of King Alfonso VI were spreading like a terminal plague across the northern territories. The fall of Toledo was not just a military defeat, it was a psychological earthquake that had shattered the confidence of every Muslim ruler from Granada to Badajoz, leaving them to realize that their refined poetry, lush gardens, and complex court intrigues were useless against the cold, sharpened steel of the Christian Reconquista. Outside the palace walls, the air was thick with the desperate whispers of a terrified populace who had heard rumors of the Castilian king's vow to wash his horse's hooves in the Mediterranean Sea, and the emir knew that his own subjects would sooner see him dead than see the cross raised over their great mosque. In this moment of absolute vulnerability, a secret messenger arrived with a letter that changed everything, bearing the seal of the Almoravids, the veiled ones of the Sahara, who had built an empire of blood and sand that stretched from the Senegal River to the edges of Algiers. Al-Mutamid felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening breeze, for he was about to invite a power into his home that was far more dangerous and unpredictable than the enemy at his gates. I would rather tend camels for the Almoravids in the scorching heat of the desert than be a swineherd for the Christians in the damp forests of the north, the emir declared to his horrified advisers, his voice echoing through the vaulted hall with a finality that silenced all protests about the legendary brutality of the Berber tribes. His counselors exchanged glances of pure terror, knowing that the men they were summoning were religious zealots who viewed the luxurious lifestyle of the Spanish Muslims as a sin deserving of a slow and painful death. The decision was a desperate gamble, a choice between being consumed by a fire from the north or being buried by a sandstorm from the south, but the sight of the Christian banners appearing on the horizon had stripped away the luxury of choice. Within hours, a fleet of messengers was dispatched across the narrow strait, carrying an official plea for military intervention to Yusuf ibn Tashfin, the supreme leader of the Almoravids, and a man whose very name caused the bravest warriors to tremble in their boots. Yusuf was not a king who sat on a gilded throne. He was a nomad general who lived in a leather tent, ate the simplest food, and led an army of thousands who believed that dying in battle was the shortest path to paradise. The response from the African coast was not a diplomatic letter or a list of conditions, but a sudden and terrifying presence that materialized on the shores of Algeciras like a dark omen rising from the depths of the sea. Thousands of Berber warriors began to disembark from hundreds of transport ships, their faces hidden behind dark indigo veils that left only their piercing predator-like eyes visible to the trembling locals who gathered to watch. They moved with a silent, mechanical discipline that was completely alien to the flamboyant displays of the Andalusian knights, and the only sound that accompanied their arrival was the rhythmic clanking of their heavy iron shields and the low, guttural chanting of prayers that sounded like a funeral dirge for the world they were about to enter. Yusuf ibn Tashfin was among the first to step onto the soil of Spain, his tall, lean frame draped in a simple woolen cloak that stood in sharp contrast to the silk robes of the emissaries who had come to greet him. He did not look at the beautiful architecture or the fertile lands with admiration. He looked at them with the cold, calculating gaze of a conqueror who saw only weakness and a lack of divine favor in the eyes of his hosts. "We have not come here to feast in your palaces or to listen to your musicians, but to cleanse this land of the infidel and to remind you what it means to be a servant of the Almighty." Yusuf spoke, his voice sounding like the grinding of stones in a dry wadi, cutting through the flowery greetings of the civilian officials like a scythe through ripe grain. The atmosphere in the southern ports shifted instantly from relief to a suffocating dread as the Almoravid army began to march inland, leaving a trail of absolute silence in their wake, because even the birds seemed to stop singing in the presence of such concentrated violence. The Spanish emirs, who had hoped for a subservient mercenary force they could control with gold and promises, realized with a sickening jolt in their stomachs that they had not invited protectors, but masters who viewed them with as much contempt as they did the Christians. Yusuf's warriors did not interact with the local population. They camped in strict circular formations, their spears planted firmly in the ground like a forest of thorns that promised a swift end to anyone who dared to challenge their authority. The Emir of Seville watched from his balcony as the black banners of the Almoravids unfurled in the wind, realizing that the sovereignty he had tried so hard to protect was already a memory, replaced by the iron will of a man who cared nothing for titles and everything for total dominion. As the sun began to set, casting long bloody shadows across the landscape, a scout from the north galloped into the Berber camp with news that King Alfonso VI had abandoned his siege of Zaragoza and was turning his entire military might toward the south to meet this new threat. The Christian king was not coming alone. He was bringing the flower of European chivalry, thousands of armored knights who had never lost a battle and who believed that their heavy lances could break any desert wall. Yusuf ibn Tashfin listened to the report without blinking, his hand resting on the hilt of a sword that had tasted the blood of kings from the Sahara to the Atlas Mountains. He turned his gaze toward the distant mountains where the Christian army was gathering, a thin, predatory smile spreading beneath his veil as he felt the first true excitement of the campaign. The collision of two worlds was no longer an inevitability. It was a reality that was rushing toward them with the speed of a charging stallion, and the soil of Al-Andalus was thirsting for the river of blood that was about to be spilled. Tell the Christian king to prepare his soul, for he has spent his life fighting men who love the world, but tomorrow he will face an army that is in love with death, Yusuf commanded, dismissing the scout with a wave of his hand that felt like a death sentence for thousands. The first part of the trap had been set, not by the emirs or the Christians, but by the desert itself, which had finally come to claim the lush valleys of the north. The night was cold, but the Berber camp remained a place of intense, quiet activity, as weapons were sharpened and horses were fed the last of the grain, while the emirs of Al-Andalus sat in their palaces, shivering with a fear they could no longer hide. They had opened the gates of the Sahara, thinking they were saving their crowns, but as the first fires of the Almoravid camp lit up the night sky, they understood that the price of their survival was the total destruction of the world they had spent centuries building. The wolves were no longer at the door. They were in the house, and they were very, very hungry. The desert wind did not just blow into the lush valleys of Al-Andalus. It bit into the soul of every Spanish nobleman who witnessed the transformation of the landscape into a sprawling, militarized hive of Berber steel. Yusuf ibn Tashfin did not waste a single hour on the pleasantries of the court, refusing the silk-draped pavilions offered by the Emir of Seville, and instead ordering his men to dig deep trenches and raise earthworks that turned their camp into an impregnable fortress of sand and iron. The local Muslim rulers, who were used to warfare being a seasonal game of chess played with gold and honorable surrenders, watched in paralyzed silence as the Almoravids practiced their formations with a brutal, repetitive precision that suggested they were preparing for a massacre rather than a battle. Yusuf's eyes remained fixed on the horizon, but his mind was navigating the treacherous waters of Andalusian politics, where every smile from a local emir felt like a dagger wrapped in velvet, and every promise of loyalty smelled of the rot of secret negotiations with the Christian North. He knew that the very men who had begged for his help were already meeting in the shadows, terrified that his presence would strip them of their harems, their wine, and their absolute power over their subjects. "My lord, the Emir of Badajoz has been seen sending a silent messenger toward the Christian lines under the cover of the morning mist, and his treasury remains locked while our men eat the meager rations of the march," whispered Sir Yusuf's most trusted lieutenant, his hand white-knuckled on the hilt of his curved blade as he gestured toward the flickering lights of the nearby city. Yusuf did not even turn his head, his gaze remaining on the distant dust clouds stirred by the approaching Castilian scouts, but the air around him seemed to drop several degrees as his silence stretched into a suffocating tension. He understood the nature of the rot. These kings were more afraid of losing their comfort to a fellow Muslim than losing their faith to a Christian conqueror, and this realization was the moment the first pillar of trust crumbled into the dust. He had come to save the faith, but he found himself surrounded by merchants dressed as monarchs, men who would sell the very gates of their cities if the price in gold was high enough to ensure another decade of decadence. The escalation of the conflict was no longer just about the approaching Christian knights. It was a dual war against the enemy in the front and the traitors in the rear, a situation that demanded a level of ruthlessness that the soft lands of Spain had not seen in centuries. The friction between the Saharan warriors and the Andalusian elite reached a breaking point when Yusuf ordered the immediate seizure of all grain stores in the region to feed his troops, ignoring the hysterical protests of the local administrators who claimed such actions would ruin the economy. To the Almoravids, the economy was a ghost, and the only reality was the sharpened edge of a spear and the strength of the arm that held it. A philosophy that turned the once welcoming cities into zones of silent, simmering hostility. Yusuf's scouts returned with intercepted letters that confirmed his darkest suspicions. King Alfonso VI was not merely marching to defend his borders, but had been promised that the gates of certain Muslim strongholds would be opened to him if he could break the Almoravid vanguard. This was the first part of the hidden truth, that the Holy War was a lie being used as a backdrop for a much filthier game of survival and greed, where the cross and the crescent were merely banners used to hide the faces of men who only worshipped power. Do they think I am a simple tribesman who cannot see the poison in their cups? Or do they believe the desert has dried my brain until I can no longer recognize the scent of a rat in the cellar? Yusuf growled, his voice a low vibration that made the torches in his tent flicker as if sensing his rising fury. The failure of diplomacy was total, and the hope for a unified front against the Christians vanished like a mirage as Yusuf realized he could trust no one but his own black-veiled brothers who had crossed the sea with him. He ordered his elite guard to surround the pavilions of the Andalusian emirs, not for their protection, but to ensure they could not flee or send further messages to the Christian camp, effectively turning his allies into his prisoners. The sense of impending doom thickened as the first heavy rains of the season began to fall, turning the fertile soil into a treacherous quagmire that favored the lighter Saharan cavalry over the lumbering, armor-heavy knights of Castile. Yusuf stood in the center of the rain, his cloak heavy with water, watching as the scouts brought news that Alfonso's army was now less than a day's march away, their numbers far exceeding the most pessimistic reports. The moment of harsh failure arrived when a sudden, daring night raid by Christian vanguard units managed to set fire to the Almoravid supply wagons, destroying a significant portion of their winter stores in a single hour of chaos and screaming horses. The Andalusian troops, who were supposed to be guarding the perimeter, had mysteriously vanished or fallen asleep at their posts, leaving the desert warriors to fight the flames and the assassins alone in the dark. As the smoke cleared and the sun began to rise over a landscape of charred wood and dead sentries, Yusuf saw the smirks on the faces of the local officials, a silent celebration of his misfortune that cut deeper than any Christian sword. He stood among the ruins of his supplies, the smell of burnt grain filling his nostrils, and he knew that the time for restraint had passed. If he was to win this war, he would have to be more terrifying than the enemy he was sent to fight. The night ended not with a plan for retreat, but with a transformation of the Almoravid camp into a site of grim religious fervor, as Yusuf ordered the drums of war to begin their relentless, bone-shaking rhythm. The sound echoed across the valleys, a primitive, terrifying heartbeat that told the Christians and the traitors alike that the Lion of the Sahara was no longer interested in alliances. He turned to his generals and gave a single command that shifted the entire strategy from defense to a suicidal, forward-leaning aggression that ignored the loss of supplies and focused entirely on the total annihilation of the opposing force. The desperation was now absolute, the hope for a clean victory dead, and the only thing remaining was the cold, hard certainty that the coming dawn would see a harvest of souls that would change the map of the world forever. The suffocating silence of the night before the slaughter was broken only by the rhythmic, metallic rasp of a whetstone against steel, a sound that seemed to echo through the valley of Sagrajas like the heartbeat of a dying world. Yusuf ibn Tashfin sat in the center of his tent, the flickering oil lamp casting long, distorted shadows that danced like vengeful spirits against the heavy canvas walls, while his mind methodically dismantled the layers of treachery that had brought him to this God-forsaken plain. He had come across the sea to defend the faith, but the forbidden knowledge he had uncovered through his network of desert scouts revealed a far more sinister reality. The Andalusian emirs, the very men who had knelt at his feet and begged for salvation, had already negotiated a secret partition of territories with King Alfonso VI. It was a revelation that turned the blood in his veins to liquid ice, for he realized that he was not an ally in a holy war, but a pawn in a cynical game of survival where his Berber warriors were meant to be slaughtered alongside the Christians to clear the path for a new era of puppet rulers. The scrolls he held in his trembling hands were not just documents. They were the blueprints of a massive betrayal that suggested Alfonso's army was not merely approaching from the north, but was being guided through hidden mountain passes by the Emir of Badajoz' own personal scouts. In the midst of this overwhelming isolation, when the void of hope seemed ready to swallow the entire Almoravid cause, a figure draped in the tattered rags of a common goat herder was dragged into the tent by the black guard, his eyes burning with a desperate, feverish intensity that demanded immediate attention. This man, known only as Idris, was a survivor of a village that had been erased from the map by the heavy cavalry of Castile, and he brought with him a piece of intelligence that was so dangerous it felt like holding a burning coal in the palm of one's hand. He spoke not of troop numbers or logistical routes, but of a secret weapon Alfonso had brought from the deep north, a specialized corps of engineers and alchemists who had constructed massive hidden catapults capable of launching jars of unquenchable fire into the center of the Almoravid camp. Idris had seen these engines of destruction being assembled in a ravine less than 3 miles from where they currently sat, a location that the emirs had deliberately omitted from the topographical maps they had provided to Yusuf. "My lord, you look for a battle of swords and honor, but the king of the Christians and the traitors who call you brother are preparing a funeral pyre for your entire nation, and they intend to watch you burn before the first horse even charges," Idris hissed, his voice cracking with a mixture of terror and a thirst for vengeance that mirrored Yusuf's own rising fury. The dialogue between the general and the peasant was not one of status, but of shared hatred for the corrupt elite who traded lives for gold, and as Idris described the exact positions of the fire engines, Yusuf felt the void of hope being replaced by a terrifying, cold clarity. He realized that the only way to survive the coming dawn was to embrace a knowledge that was forbidden to the honorable warrior. He had to strike first, not at the army, but at the very foundations of the alliance that sought to destroy him. He ordered Idris to be given a horse and a blade, recognizing in this lowly peasant the only true ally he had found on this cursed peninsula, a man whose loyalty was forged in the fire of shared loss rather than the false promises of kings. The strategy for the Battle of Sagrajas shifted in that moment from a defensive stand to a preemptive strike of such calculated brutality that it would leave the world gasping for breath. Yusuf summoned his generals, not to ask for their counsel, but to issue commands that felt like the hammering of nails into a coffin, his voice resonating with a power that seemed to vibrate through the very ground they stood upon. He commanded the elite camel corps to move out immediately under the cover of the midnight mist, not toward the Christian vanguard, but toward the ravine Idris had identified, with orders to slaughter every engineer and alchemist they found, without uttering a single word. He then ordered his main force to split into 3 divisions, one of which was tasked with surrounding the pavilions of the Andalusian emirs, to ensure that not a single messenger could escape to warn Alfonso that the trap had been discovered. The forbidden knowledge had transformed Yusuf from a defender of the faith into a dark architect of destiny, a man who would use the darkness of the night to rewrite the history of Spain in the blood of those who thought they were his masters. As the midnight hour passed, the air in the camp became charged with an electric tension, a sense of all or nothing that made the horses restless, and the men speak only in hushed, urgent tones of prayer and murder. Yusuf stood outside his tent, watching the silhouettes of his warriors vanish into the fog, and he felt a strange sense of liberation in the realization that he no longer owed anything to the kings of this land. The hope he had found in the void was a dark hope, one that thrived on the destruction of the old order and the birth of a world where only the strong and the sincere would survive the coming storm. He looked toward the northern mountains, where the campfires of Alfonso's massive host flickered like the eyes of a predator, and he felt a grim satisfaction in knowing that the predator was about to become the prey. The final part of the secret truth was revealed when Yusuf's personal guard returned with a captured Christian spy who carried a letter signed by the Emir of Seville himself, promising Alfonso that the Almoravid center would be left unsupported at the moment of the first charge. This was the ultimate confirmation of the rot that had infected the heart of Al-Andalus, a betrayal so deep that it justified any level of violence Yusuf chose to unleash in the hours to come. He did not execute the spy. Instead, he forced the man to write a false report stating that the Almoravids were retreating in panic, a lie that would lure Alfonso into a reckless, disorganized pursuit into the very mouth of Yusuf's hidden reserves. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would transcend simple warfare, turning the valley of Sagrajas into a theater of divine judgment, where the price of treachery would be paid in a currency of iron and fire. Let them come with their crosses and their secret treaties, for they have forgotten that the desert does not negotiate with the wind, and by the time the sun reaches its zenith, there will be no kings left in this valley to count the dead, Yusuf proclaimed to the silent night, his words a final seal on the fate of the armies that were even now beginning to move in the shadows. The transition from Act 3 to Act 4 was marked by the sudden distant sound of a single horn blast, a signal that the fire engines had been destroyed and that the first blood of the battle had been spilled in the dark. It was a sound that signaled the end of diplomacy and the beginning of a carnage that would echo through the centuries, a reminder that the most dangerous man is the one who has looked into the void and found his purpose within it. Yusuf ibn Tashfin pulled his veil tight across his face, his eyes glowing with a predatory light as he prepared to lead his men into a confrontation where everything would be lost or everything would be won. The void was no longer empty. It was filled with the promise of a victory so absolute that it would leave the listener breathless, wondering how a single man could defy the weight of an entire world's betrayal. The dawn over Sagrajas did not arrive with a gentle light. but with a blood-red sun that struggled to pierce through a fog so thick it felt like a heavy, wet shroud over the thousands of men who were about to die. King Alfonso VI, fueled by the false reports of an Almoravid retreat and the secret promises of the treacherous emirs, ordered his heavy knights to launch a massive, crushing charge before the heat of the day could sap the strength of their Andalusian chargers. The ground began to tremble with a low, rhythmic vibration that escalated into a deafening roar as 6,000 armored horsemen, the literal iron fist of Christendom, lowered their lances and accelerated into a terrifying gallop toward the Almoravid center. Yusuf ibn Tashfin stood his ground at the head of the Sudanese Black Guard, a wall of 4,000 fanatical warriors who had chained themselves together to ensure that no man could flee, their massive hide shields forming a literal fortress of skin and wood that awaited the impact of the steel avalanche. The collision was a sound that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives, a cacophony of shattering wood, screaming horses, and the horrific crunch of metal through bone as the Christian knights slammed into the Berber lines with the force of a falling mountain. Lances splintered against the Sudanese shields, and for a moment it seemed that the sheer weight of the armored tide would wash over the desert warriors, as the first three ranks were physically pulverized into the mud under the hooves of the great war horses. But the chains held, and the Berber infantry, driven by a mixture of religious fervor and the raw desperation of men who had nowhere to retreat, began to hamstring the horses with short, curved blades, dragging the elite knights from their saddles into the blood-soaked earth where they were finished off in the gaps of their plate armor. Yusuf saw the moment his center began to buckle under the second wave of Alfonso's assault, and he knew that the emirs of Seville and Granada were watching from the distant hills, waiting for the signal to either join the victory or flee the disaster. He realized that the human strength he needed to find was not the heroic virtue of the legends, but the cold, jagged stubbornness of a man who refused to let the world break him. Even when his lungs were burning and his sword arm felt like lead, he did not call for the emirs. Instead, he mounted his own stallion and ordered the great drums to beat a rhythm so intense it felt like it was tearing the very air apart, signaling his hidden reserve, the elite Saharan camel corps, to emerge from behind the southern dunes. These thousands of dromedaries, smelling of musk and the deep desert, charged into the fray with a terrifying guttural roar that panicked the Christian horses, who had never encountered such beasts, turning the organized nightly charge into a chaotic, screaming whirlpool of uncontrollable animals. "Look at them, the kings of the north who thought they could ride over us like grass. They are falling now because they trusted in their iron, while we trust in the fire that burns within a soul that has nothing left to lose but its honor," Yusuf roared, his voice cutting through the din of battle as he personally led his guard into the gap, his blade swinging in wide, lethal arcs that left a trail of crimson in the gray morning mist. The climax of the battle reached its fever pitch when Alfonso X, seeing his elite vanguard being slaughtered, threw his entire remaining force into a final, desperate gamble to kill Yusuf himself, leading a wedge of 300 personal bodyguards directly toward the Almoravid command post. The two worlds collided in a narrow corridor of mud and corpses, where the refined chivalry of Europe met the primal ferocity of the Sahara in a contest that had no room for mercy or retreat. Yusuf found himself face to face with a high-ranking Castilian count, their blades clashing with a spark that seemed to ignite the very fog around them, and in that moment of all or nothing, Yusuf did not rely on superior technique, but on a raw, animalistic anger that drove his shield into the knight's face before driving his dagger through the throat-piece of the armor. The internal transformation of the hero was complete. He was no longer a general following a strategy, but a force of nature that had accepted the possibility of total annihilation, and found a strange, terrifying power within that acceptance. He saw King Alfonso, wounded and surrounded, fighting with the frantic energy of a trapped wolf, and for a split second their eyes met across the field of slaughter, a moment of mutual recognition between two predators who understood that only one could leave this valley alive. The ground was no longer earth. It was a swamp of gore and broken metal, where every step was a struggle, and every breath was a prayer for an end to the carnage. The Christian line finally snapped under the weight of the Almoravid reserves, the knights turning to flee only to find that the mountain passes they had used to arrive were now blocked by the very peasants and scouts they had once despised. The confrontation ended not with a formal surrender, but with a sudden, eerie silence that fell over the valley as the last organized resistance of the Castilian army was systematically extinguished under the desert sun. Alfonso VI, his leg pierced by a Berber spear and his army shattered into 1,000 pieces, was spirited away by a handful of surviving knights under the cover of a sudden dust storm, leaving the field to the veiled ones who had come to save a land that now belonged to them. Yusuf stood in the center of the carnage, his armor black with blood and his breathing ragged, looking at the thousands of dead who carpeted the plain from one end to the other. He had won the battle, but as he looked toward the hills where the emirs were now tentatively descending to claim a share of the glory, he felt a surge of contempt that was more powerful than any fatigue. Everything had been lost in terms of the old alliances, but Yusuf had found a new, harder reality, the realization that he did not need the permission of kings to rule, only the strength of his own will and the loyalty of the men who had bled beside him. The scale of the victory was so massive that it seemed to tilt the very axis of the world. But for Yusuf, the only thing that mattered was the weight of the sword in his hand and the cold certainty that the real war was only just beginning. He turned his back on the retreating Christians and the approaching emirs, walking toward the great drums that were still beating a slow, funereal pulse for the thousands who would never leave Sagrajas. The confrontation was over, but the resolution would be a reckoning that none of them, friend or foe, were truly prepared to face. The sun reached its zenith over the valley of Sagrajas, casting a harsh, unforgiving light upon a landscape that had been transformed into a macabre sea of broken iron and cooling flesh. Yusuf ibn Tashfin did not join the victory chants of his soldiers. Instead, he stood atop a mound of captured Christian shields, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the remnants of the once mighty Castilian army vanished into a haze of dust and defeat. The Emirs of Seville and Granada approached him with forced smiles and elaborate praise, their silk robes fluttering in the hot wind as they prepared to reclaim the lands his Berber warriors had just paid for in blood. They spoke of returning to their palaces, of treaties to be signed, and of the generous gold they would pay the Almoravids to return to the Sahara now that the Christian threat had been pushed back. But Yusuf did not look at them with the eyes of a mercenary. He looked at them with the cold, calculating judgment of a man who had seen the rot in their hearts and decided that the cure would be more painful than the disease. You speak of gold and borders as if this land is a piece of cloth to be traded in a marketplace, but you have forgotten that the soil of Al-Andalus has just drunk the blood of 4,000 of my brothers who died because of your cowardice and your secret deals with the cross. Yusuf's voice was a low, resonant growl that silenced the emirs mid-sentence, the air around them suddenly heavy with the threat of immediate violence. The moral dilemma was laid bare in the terrifying stillness that followed. Should he return to the desert and leave these corrupt rulers to inevitably fall once more to the Christians, or should he break his promise to remain a mere protector and instead become a conqueror of his own people? He saw the terror in the emir's eyes, a realization that they had invited a power that recognized no authority but the divine and no law but the edge of a sword. The transformation of Yusuf was final. He was no longer a defender of the old world, but the architect of a new, uncompromising order that viewed the luxury of Spain as a cancer to be excised. He realized that to save Al-Andalus, he had to destroy the very men who claimed to lead it, a choice that weighed upon his soul not as a sin, but as a grim, unavoidable necessity of history. The resolution arrived not with a celebration, but with a series of swift, brutal commands that saw the emir's personal guards disarmed and their pavilions surrounded by the same black guard that had broken the Christian charge. Yusuf announced that the Almoravids would not be retreating to the Sahara, but would instead establish a permanent military administration across all the southern territories, effectively stripping the emirs of their sovereignty in a single hour of political theater. The shock of the betrayal, or perhaps the ultimate justice, left the local rulers paralyzed, as they realized they were now prisoners in the very land they had once owned. Yusuf did not offer them a chance to argue. He simply turned his back on them and walked toward the great mosque of the nearest captured town, his mind already calculating the fortifications and the taxes needed to sustain a perpetual war against the north. The final message of the story was etched into the silent, blood-soaked earth of Sagrajas, that peace is a fragile illusion maintained only by the strength of those willing to die for it, and that the greatest danger to any civilization is not the enemy at the gates, but the corruption within them. The open final left the fate of Spain hanging in a delicate balance, for while the Christians had been defeated, a new, more rigid shadow now stretched across the peninsula, one that promised security at the cost of the very culture it sought to protect. Yusuf ibn Tashfin sat alone in the quiet of the evening, the screams of the dying finally replaced by the call to prayer, and he felt the immense weight of the crown he had not yet put on, but which already sat upon his brow. He had saved the faith, but in doing so he had become the very thing the emirs feared most, a king who did not believe in kings. The story of the Reconquista had not ended. It had merely entered a darker, more intense chapter where the lines between savior and tyrant were blurred into the red horizon. The listener is left with the haunting image of Yusuf standing at the edge of the sea, looking back at the mountains and then toward the African coast, knowing that he could never truly go home again. The desert had come to Spain, and it had no intention of leaving until it had bleached the bones of every man who thought he could control the wind. The silence of the valley was the only answer to the questions of the future, a silence that spoke of empires yet to rise and blood yet to be spilled in the name of a peace that was nothing more than a pause between storms. The last of the Christian banners lay trampled in the mud, a forgotten scrap of silk that no longer held any power over the hearts of the living. Yusuf pulled his veil tight, hiding his face from the world, as he prepared to march into the cities of the south, his heart as cold and enduring as the dunes of his birth. The end was not a conclusion, but a sharp, sudden severance of the past, leaving the audience to wonder if the price of survival was ever truly worth the loss of the soul. The drums began to beat once more, a steady, relentless pulse that signaled the start of a march that would not stop until the pillars of the world itself were shaken.